The candles flickered in the royal nursery, shadows twisting across the stone walls as a newborn's cry shattered the silence. Outside, bells tolled across London, announcing England's long-awaited male heir, yet inside, a fragile life lay under constant watch. The air smelled faintly of wax and cold stone, a life both celebrated and imprisoned from its first breath. What happens when a child inherits absolute power too soon? Edward VI's every smile, every word, every tiny gesture was scrutinized. Devotion became obsession, protection became prison. Isolation wrapped around him like iron chains, shaping not a boy, but a monarch forged by fear. Few remember that the gentle child became one of England's most severe rulers. His health failed under the weight of expectation, but the real tragedy was deeper: a kingdom's hopes, a father's paranoia, and the corruption of innocence. By the end, even his short reign left a shadow haunting the Tudor line. Today, we speak of childhood as a time of innocence, yet history tells a colder story. Power can twist even the purest beginnings. Edward's cradle, once a symbol of hope, became a warning. Divine destiny or prison of isolation? But before the darkness claimed him fully, his story had already been written, in power, devotion, and obsession. The birth of Edward VI marked a turning point in Tudor England. The kingdom, fraught with dynastic uncertainty, had waited years for a male heir. Jane Seymour's successful delivery brought immediate jubilation, yet it came at a cruel cost. She died just 12 days later, leaving Edward motherless, swaddled in the reverence and fear of a court desperate for male succession. From his earliest days, Edward's life was defined by extreme protection, yet extreme isolation. Tutors and courtiers formed a constant ring, shaping the boy not for childhood, but for kingship. John Check, his chief tutor, introduced the young prince to a rigorous regimen of theology, statecraft, and classical learning. By age 8, Edward could articulate arguments against Catholicism with chilling clarity, his intellect sharpened to a weapon. The boy's emotional world was barren. Ordinary pleasures were forbidden, laughter, a rare guest. Play was non-existent. Every gesture, every word from the boy, was interpreted as a sign of divine destiny. Edward learned to see the hierarchy of the world in black and white, himself at the top, divinely ordained, absolute. Observers whispered about his intensity, the eerie seriousness in his small frame. His intellect, paired with emotional starvation, was forging a dangerous combination. Already, Edward's mind catalogued obedience and sin, imagining punishments, and memorizing doctrines that would govern life and death. In Edward's earliest moments, England's fragile hope was already shadowed by the first signs of a nightmare yet to unfold. Autumn 1547 brought an unimaginable shift. 9-year-old Edward VI ascends to the throne. Henry VIII's death leaves a realm fractured by religious upheaval. England had broken from Rome, yet Catholic sentiment remained entrenched. The boy inherited not only a crown but a nation in peril. Edward's Regency Council, led by Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, attempted moderation. But the boy king, trained from infancy to enforce divine law, had his own agenda. From his earliest council sessions, Edward displayed a startling certainty, correcting advisors on theology and governance, asserting authority beyond his years. His interventions were not mere juvenile enthusiasm, they carried the weight of a monarch convinced of divine mandate. Court records describe the boy's fascination with executions, particularly of heretics. Edward weighed life and death with a detachment that terrified observers. He signed warrants with a serene smile, pleased with his ability to cloak cruelty in biblical authority. Rumors spread of drawings in his chamber depicting instruments of torment, annotated in meticulous detail. The Regency Council feared the boy's obsession with control. Even when proposals suggested tolerance or moderation, Edward's anger was swift and precise. He would hurl objects, shout scripture, and insist divine retribution would punish leniency. The young king's mind, trained in rigorous logic and theological precision, transformed youthful curiosity into fanaticism. A boy trained in obedience and fear. Edward VI, 9 years old, absolute power. Edward's early rule set a precedent for his reign. Isolation, rigorous education, and relentless adoration had created not a child, but a calculating monarch. The machinery of fear was already forming, quietly reshaping the kingdom in his image. The innocence of childhood was gone, replaced by the cold, unwavering certainty of divine purpose. Edward's obsession with religious purity extended into every corner of his kingdom. Parishioners, nobles, and servants alike were subjected to surveillance. Children were taught to report Catholic sympathies in parents. Neighbors spied on each other, fostering a culture of suspicion. Mercy became synonymous with weakness. Obedience became a moral imperative enforced by fear. In his journal, Edward meticulously recorded punishments, evaluating their effectiveness with the precision of a scholar. A servant who faltered was subject not only to correction but public humiliation, with Edward observing and noting reactions. He wrote of clergy, nobles, and household members in the same clinical tone, equating disobedience with sin, deviation with heresy. Even his family was not spared. Mary, his elder half-sister and devout Catholic, was an obstacle. Letters reveal Edward's hostility, imagining her renunciation of faith, her imprisonment, or worse. Elizabeth, though Protestant, was valued only for political alliances. Relationships were transactional, guided by utility and ideology rather than affection. The court became a theater of control. Informants were rewarded, dissenters punished. Fear permeated the corridors, and Edward's fascination with this machinery of power surpassed any adult tyrant. Observers noted that the boy not only approved punishments but designed them, relishing the precision with which obedience could be engineered. The palace, once a space of learning and ceremony, had transformed into a laboratory for tyranny, and the boy at its center was both student and master. By age 12, Edward's interventions extended beyond church and court. Policy became obsession. Mandatory attendance, standardized liturgy, and relentless enforcement of Protestantism created a kingdom policed not just by law, but by conscience weaponized against its own citizens. Servants, nobles, and ordinary citizens lived in quiet dread. Minor deviations could lead to imprisonment, torture, or execution. Edward personally reviewed reports, ensuring punishments were calibrated to Scripture. Even ceremonial corrections became exercises in authority, teaching obedience through fear. Edward's health, always fragile, began to decline. Physicians attempted treatments ranging from mercury to arsenic. Instead of softening his zeal, illness intensified his fanaticism. He dictated harsher proclamations, reinforced surveillance networks, and plotted the succession that would bypass his sisters in favor of Lady Jane Grey. Divine right or divine tyranny? A kingdom policed by a child. Edward's obsession with purity, reinforced by isolation, created a pattern: cruelty justified as divine work, loyalty measured in fear, mercy seen as weakness. His emotional development remained frozen in adolescence, even as his mind orchestrated adult-level cruelty across England. As illness crept in, the boy king's fanaticism became his final legacy, a blueprint for tyranny before death would claim him. Edward's final years were consumed by planning the continuation of his religious project. He conspired with John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, to install Lady Jane Grey, a Protestant cousin, as his successor. Mary and Elizabeth were to be removed from influence, their claims erased in the name of divine destiny. The documents Edward signed are chilling in their detail. Lists of Catholics to be executed, monasteries to be seized, and estates to be purged reflect a mind consumed by theological vision and political strategy. Even as illness consumed him, his handwriting remained precise, deliberate, unwavering in cruelty. Each list, each edict, was written with careful attention, as if he were continuing a classroom exercise, testing his mastery over life, death, and obedience. Edward's correspondence reveals an unsettling obsession with the mechanics of succession. He meticulously reviewed every potential rival, instructed his allies to secure their loyalty, and demanded that Lady Jane Grey be prepared to assume the throne immediately upon his passing. His advisers, aware of his frailty, tried to temper his ambition with caution, but Edward's zeal left little room for compromise. Even small delays or dissent were treated as threats to his divine mission. As he grew weaker, Edward's mind seemed to sharpen with a strange intensity. Fever and illness did not dull his focus. Instead, they appeared to fuel his single-minded pursuit of what he considered God's will. Every document, every signed decree, reinforced the Protestant project he had nurtured since childhood. Even in moments of extreme pain, Edward reviewed the kingdom as though it were a chessboard, positioning allies and enemies with precision and ruthless logic. The conspiracy itself was a testament to both Edward's brilliance and his danger. By selecting Lady Jane Grey, He aimed to ensure a continuation of his reforms, a safeguard against the return of Catholic influence. Yet this plan was brittle. It relied on perfect execution, loyal allies, and swift action, all of which the fragile and fevered boy could not guarantee. Still, Edward pressed forward, convinced that divine providence would bend the kingdom to his will, even from the edge of death. The boy king's death would soon render all his designs moot, but the machinery he created left a kingdom scarred by fear and surveillance. Edward's final act, a kingdom planned for obedience, yet doomed by his own mortality. By July 1553, Edward VI's fragile body could no longer withstand the relentless pressures of illness, exhaustion, and possibly the toxic medical treatments prescribed by his physicians. Mercury, arsenic, and other remedies meant to restore him only accelerated his decline. Courtiers watched in horror as the boy king convulsed, his pale skin streaked with greenish hues, his once bright eyes dimmed by fever and suffering. Witnesses described scenes both terrifying and pitiful, the small king shouting scripture one moment, then writhing in pain the next. Even in these final days, Edward's mind refused to yield. He dictated new proclamations, reinforcing his vision of a thoroughly Protestant England. Mercy remained an alien concept. His final directives included plans to bypass his half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth, installing Lady Jane Grey as his successor. He envisioned a kingdom cleansed of Catholic influence, surveilled by networks of loyal subjects and informants. Every word he wrote, every order he signed, revealed a mind consumed by faith, power, and fear. Yet his death also carried a strange salvation. The death of the boy king spared England from the total realization of his obsessive plans. Mary, restored to the throne within days, began to undo his Protestant reforms, stabilizing the realm after years of religious extremism. Courtiers, once trembling at Edward's commands, quietly celebrated survival. Relief, not grief, marked Edward's passing for many. Death of a boy king, birth of a nation's relief. Edward VI, 15 years, a kingdom in fear. Edward's final moments cast a long shadow. The boy who had been groomed for godly perfection died still clinging to his belief that his work was righteous, leaving a kingdom both scarred and momentarily safe. Edward's death marked not just the end of a reign, but the fragile salvation of a nation teetering on the edge of fanaticism. Edward VI's story did not end with his death. Its consequences reverberated for decades. He remains a chilling example of how youth, intellect, and authority can combine into something terrifying when divorced from empathy. Contemporary historians no longer see him simply as a sickly boy manipulated by adults. Instead, documents, journals, and decrees reveal a child monarch capable of deliberate cruelty, guided by the conviction that he served God. His reign demonstrates how education without compassion, power without guidance, and certainty without mercy can create terror. Edward's surveillance networks, obsession with religious purity, and fascination with punishment left a kingdom wary, fearful, and divided. Even Protestant reformers, whose cause he championed, recoiled from the extremity of his actions. The machinery he created shaped English governance, social relations, and religious perception long after his passing. Modern parallels are striking. Edward's obsessive control and ideological enforcement resemble totalitarian regimes centuries later, illustrating how young rulers, armed with unchecked authority, can produce unintended devastation. His story resonates today as a warning about the dangers of absolute power, especially when combined with rigid ideology and isolation. Power without mercy can corrupt even innocence. Edward VI, a child's rule, a nation's fear. Edward VI's legacy is complex. While he intended to secure England for Protestantism, the extremity of his actions discredited the cause and inadvertently paved the way for a temporary Catholic restoration under Mary. His name faded from public prayers, portraits collected dust, and the boy king became a whispered cautionary tale, a parable of how innocence, ambition, and certainty can converge into tyranny. The reign of Edward VI reminds us that absolute power, no matter how young the holder, can leave scars deeper than any sword or